Thank you so much, Jonathan, and what a privilege it is to be here today. It's, yes, rather strange that you got stuck with two Romanians. And as I was getting ready for this meeting, I found it both a big privilege to be here and to be speaking in Cambridge, that for me as an academic is like the center of the academic world still, and it's the closest to my heart university. But also I find it rather unexpected somehow. 30 years ago, this would have been impossible. And you know, as a young person, everybody, we have our dreams. This has never been on my dreams, ever. We could not think of it. We didn't know anything about it because, as you know, Romania was under communism at that time, and in December we'll be celebrating 30 years since then. And as during my academic career, I had to ask myself, to what do I owe my becoming? How did I get where I am? How did I get to be interested in the things I'm interested? I came back over and over again to the answer, I owe everything to technology and English language. I have to agree with that. But to technology. Because I realized that we are living in very unusual and interesting times, and somehow I found myself in the middle of the stream of change that worked in my favor. And as a teenager, as I had to prepare to become an adult and look for a job or something, my high school went through an unexpected change due to industrialization. It was a high school specialized in social sciences, and overnight they just changed the profile into an industrial school to fit a regime that needed more prepared people for a society in fully industrialized gear. And then, when I had to choose to what university to go to, I ended up joining thousands of engineers being prepared in the Romanian schools to become engineers for the same type of society. And then, one day, everything changed. And we still remember with my husband that morning of December 22nd, when after a full night of listening to Radio Free Europe, to try to understand what's going on in our country, we see on the TV this small black and white TV set that actually only had 2 hours of program every day, all political. We see this group of disorganized and almost hysterical people led by an actor declaring that the dictator has fled. And we just kneeled and we started crying, and we knew things will change. However, I never knew how much they will change. And it took many years and some more education and learning to realize that actually at the core of that change was also technology. Because years later I understood that the fall of the Iron Curtain and all the political changes came within a context where communication came to a place where you couldn't keep closed society like we had them before. So there was one big event that we can all relate to, and maybe in the Western world you didn't have anything as dramatic as that, but I'm sure everybody has their own story regarding how technology has changed things around them, or in their career, or in their jobs, or in anything else. And this is because technology has always been there and always a part of our lives. And you know, we have Marshall McLuhan, who says that technology is an extension of our body. It's an extension of a part of our body or a function of our body. And we see that we extend more and more parts that we almost don't recognize where the body starts and where technology continues. And during the mechanical age, we could see these changes very visible, but now they're more invisible but much more powerful, and still they make a lot of changes in our lives. And these changes that technology became very critical in the last 30 years, and then maybe more in the last 20 and more in the last 10. And if we just look at what social media did to us and what another communication revolution we are witnessing through social media that has changed completely the way we relate to each other, it's another example of the impact of technology. And what happens is that we are moving towards an era where technology is more discussed, more part of our lives as even humans. And they tend to call this thinking post-humanism. Now, post-humanism is a very complicated concept, and it has many facets. And as I was reading about it, I realized that we cannot cover all of them. So I'll just mention two of the most extreme. Well, one of the extreme and one that to me sounded more interesting. The extreme would be people who consider post-humanism as being a moment in time, not far from now, when as humans we will not inhabit our bodies anymore as we do now, or at least we will exist in a different form that would be called post-human. But then there's also the other side that talks about post-humanism as being, a term part of probably three elements. One is the ism, which means that it's an ideology, a thinking, a way of looking, a philosophy. And there's a post of humanism. Now, post doesn't necessarily mean that it is beyond or it furthers, it takes a step further humanism, but rather that it's building on some of the elements of humanism. And then we have to look at humanism actually. What is humanism? And I won't go into too much detail, but we have humanism as the philosophy, the worldview of the 16th century, Renaissance and modernity, and linked to the Greek philosophy. That's one way of looking at humanism. Then we have also the humanism that it's secularized and split away from religion in the rationalist era, and also the humanism of the human rights that were defined after World War II. And actually those came as a need to sort of repair some of the flaws of humanism. Because while humanism had great values and it sounded great, in practice actually it didn't really fulfill what it wanted. So post-humanism, some would define as a period when we're going to build on the flaws of humanism and have another basis to look at. But until we get to humanism, we talk about transhumanism. It's one way of getting there. And when we think of technology, we wonder, is it good or is it bad? Does it help us or doesn't it help us? And personally, sometimes we have a position towards that. Sometimes we see people around us either embracing it with all their being or rejecting it totally. So I found it very helpful to look at the way Andrew Thunberg, a technology philosopher, framed the thinking regarding technology and what it does to us based on two questions. And actually, this is just a short sketch. The two questions that we have to answer in order to position ourselves is, can actually humans control technology? Do we have a control over it or not? Obviously, a level of control. And does technology have intrinsic moral value? Is it good or bad? And based on how we answer this question, we position ourselves in one area or the other. And to me, this is very helpful for myself to see how do I relate. And I'll just go briefly over it. Determinism means that you say, no, actually we cannot control technology, we don't have control over it, and technology doesn't have a moral value. Technology is just technology. So determinists, techno-determinists consider that actually technology is the driving force of society for the better. And since I will be referring to art and cinema, this is the era when there was a lot of science fiction in the 60s and the 70s, with human conquering the universe, with Star Trek, with Star Wars, with Odyssey, Space Odyssey. This idea that we're actually furthering ourselves into space and into other worlds. Now, if we say we cannot control, but actually technology has moral values, then you are a substantivist that would say not always technology takes us in a positive direction. And it is much more of some of the thinking today that we see in sci-fi, with films that start on a dystopic future where, because of some sort of mistake, technological cataclysm that we brought on ourselves, the earth is destroyed or on the brink of extinction or whatever. So this is a pessimist look on what technology does to us. Instrumentalism is basically, saying guns don't kill people, people kill people. The technology itself doesn't have moral value, but we can control it. So no matter the technology, we are in charge of it. Obviously, the critical theory would say that we should have in place certain structures that control what we do with technology and make sure that we are aware of what we're doing. So this was just an idea of how we can look at technology from different perspectives. And coming back now to transhumanism, I just want to introduce you to three men and three approaches, and some are artists, some other people I will explain immediately. But why this to me are interesting is that two of them I met personally. The first one is Neil Harbison. He is a young man who was born colorblind, and I met him in 2003 at a conference, and I was outraged at first. He just walked in the room with a headset, with a camera here, like a lamp, with headphones on his head, with a backpack, with his laptop on, and I had no idea why he showed up at that event with all this gear on him, until I realized that actually he was getting a prize for the application that he invented to help him hear color instead of seeing. And I will let you see how he explains himself. No sound. Oh. Let me see if I can make it speak.
My name is Neil Harbison, and I was born with a random condition called achromatopsis. Because I come from a grayscale world, which is total color blindness. So I've never seen color, and I don't know what color looks like. To me, the sky is always gray, the grass is always gray, and television is still in black and white. Since the age of 21, I can hear color. Concerts are the colorful experience, and art color is the musical experience. Antenna allows me to hear the color in front of me, light sensor that detects the frequency of the color, and then it sends me to the chip, and then I hear the colors before conduction. I dress in a way that it sounds good, so I decide what notes I want to wear. Today, for example, I'm wearing F sharp and C sharp. Usually it depends on how good the bass sounds.
Okay, so he had all that gear at that time because that was the technology, and actually the whole technology costed about 60 euros at the time. Meanwhile, as technology evolved, he had the camera that reads the light, the wavelength of the light. He had it implanted on his skull, and he has a chip in his head so that he can hear the sound directly in his head. Actually, I understand he can get phone calls directly in his head. He doesn't have to listen to them. he speaks in many situations, and actually I think he's also a British citizen and a Spanish citizen, although now he lives in Barcelona. But he's known as being the first cyborg with a passport, because he needed a new passport, and he insisted that he's not going to take the gear off while the picture is being taken. You know, we need to take off our glasses, but he didn't take off his camera, and this way he was the first official cyborg. And when he speaks about this technology, he says, my brain adapted, and now I feel like I have a sixth sense. I can hear color, so I dress in a tone that I feel like, C sharp or another tone. He took further, so starting with this very practical thing, and actually if I would meet him, I would ask him why he doesn't get now the glasses that would help you to see in color. Obviously, he would say, because I have another sense now, and I prefer this sense that I have. And he developed an organization called Transspecies Society. And one of my students applied for a residency in this Transspecies Society in Barcelona, because my student wanted to get involved with a sensor that would help you to sense north at all times. This is an enhancement of your self in different directions. And actually, he's speaking a little bit about that, about the Cyborg Foundation and his work. And let's hear what he has to say.
In 2010, we organized the Cyborg Foundation, which is an international platform that helps people without their own senses and organs. So the aim is to allow people to do the type of senses and organs they want to have. And then we create teams in order to build these senses. We also design cyborg rights, the right to design yourself, the right to decide what senses and organs you want to have. And now the latest project is that we've started an association in Barcelona called the Transspecies Society, where people can become a member from anywhere in the world, and then these senses are created in community. So people can create these new orders and senses as a group process. So it's more of a community.
So you have here an example of an activist transhumanist. And let's see what he thinks about the potential of the cyborg in the future.
Well, I think the future of our species, I think, is relevant that we start thinking of it as that we. I think that we need to start designing ourselves. That's the biggest change of our generation. That we need to change the way we, as a species, been good functioning. We've been for thousands of years changing the planet and designing the planet in order to be more comfortable in it. Whereas if we start designing ourselves, this will change. The more we design ourselves, the less we'll have to design the planet. Which means that if we all, for example, have night vision, cities will be dark. So we wouldn't have to spend so much energy creating artificial light if we had night vision. So cities would be dark, and that would mean that we wouldn't be spending so much energy to create all these lights. So it would be much better for the environment if we had night vision. Also, if we could control our own temperature, we wouldn't have to use air conditioning or heaters. That means we won't have to heat up the planet when it's cold and cold the planet when it's hot. It doesn't make sense. It's much more logical to design ourselves than to design the planet. And whenever there's a state of ethical, that's when it will change. In the end, it will be much better for the environment and for other species, because we are affecting other species a lot by changing the planet.
So here we are looking at humans in relationship with the nature, saying that we should change and not tame the nature to fit us, but for us to enhance our senses so that we can live in the nature without changing it. Transhumanism has three great areas that it promotes. One of them is super longevity, one it's super well-being, one it's super intelligence. Now, I believe this would fall under super well-being, having more powers like a super hero, But let's look at something else that has to do with super longevity or even immortality in different ways. Now, Marius Ursache, he's from Iași, and he was a student in our master program, and he was trained as a doctor, bright young man, who, after following a workshop of entrepreneurship at MIT, he came up with a very interesting idea for a business. The business is called Eternity Me, and basically it's proposing to collect your digital footprint and build an avatar out of it, so that when you die, that avatar, powered by artificial intelligence, would be able to continue to develop itself and communicate with your loved ones. So let's hear how he's explaining it.
What we're trying to do is collect all your digital footprint, and based on that, make sense of all that information and create an intelligent avatar that's able to talk like you. So ideally, your grandchildren will be able to talk to this avatar after you pass away, so they can find out things about your grandfather.
So help me understand. I would hand over my data space, and you would create a digital avatar of me, a digital clone of me, that would live on forever.
Yes.
All right.
At the start of the interview, he actually says, this is like Skyping with the dead. So there was an outrage in the press, well, outrage. There was a lot of publicity around it on CNN and everywhere, and I couldn't believe that I see Marius on all those situations. And then I followed him and I looked at what he's doing, and after a while, he toned it down a little bit. And this is a presentation from the website of what the project is now.
Turner, founded by MIT fellow Marius Ursache, is using social media to offer people comfort over the loss of their loved ones. The project, which draws inspiration from science fiction, allows people to build a digital copy of themselves, one which Ursache claims will eventually be able to interact with loved ones via Eternum's mobile apps. The startup involves algorithms that scrape through posts and interactions on social media to build a profile. By studying a person's memories and mannerisms, Ursache says they're able to create what he calls immortal avatars. Ursache says the goal of the service, which is still being tested, is to create a digital legacy that allows your great-grandchildren to interact with their great-grandfather and beyond.
Now, I worked with a psychologist, and we wrote an article around it because the implications are huge in terms of the grief process, of what does it mean to live or not to live, to say goodbye. And I'm sure that you've seen this theme over and over again in some of the films. And one of them is The Black Mirror, where there is an episode exactly on this direction, and it's by no means the only application, the only product. Many people are developing applications in this direction, and they seem to be very successful. So this has to do with super longevity, with how do we define humanity in terms of its finite time frame, and what does it happen with us after, and how do we relate. And here technology comes to redefine it, or to force us in a corner. We have to take a position on how do we deal with this. Now the third person, I hate it from the beginning, but as I studied more and more what he's doing, I developed an appreciation for the way he can express in an. How many of you are familiar with Stellark? He is considered to be the most well-known transhumanist artist. He's a performer, and some of his performances that he started in the 70s, he's by no means a young man, are really shocking. So I avoided bringing any images. However, there will be a little bit of distorting, a few seconds, and I apologize for it. I couldn't edit it out. So discretion should be used. But Some of his performances, he illustrated very well McLaughlin's theory of technology as an extension. And he even, in one of his performances, he attached a mechanical arm to his arm. So it was called the third arm. And just wanted to explain that, we can extend ourselves if we want through technology. And what he did was he implemented electrodes on the other parts of his body, and while he was controlling his third arm with his second arm, the first arm and part of his body were linked to the internet, and anyone could manipulate them by sending electrical impulses. So his body was going in all directions, and it's a very gruesome performance, but at the same time very powerful in showing us how we lose control to technology and how we are actually handing over our control. Now, let's hear him speak a little bit about his visions that are very evolutionist, and his philosophy regarding the body. And also you will see another shocking performance that he did.
We're increasingly expected to perform in mixed reality. We're still biological bodies, but increasingly we're accelerated by our machines, we're enhanced by our instruments, our computational capabilities are amplified with new technologies. So the body can be seen as a construct of meat, metal, and code. Well, there are already experiments done genetically, meshing the DNA of plants, animals, and humans. So we're already doing experiments with that. Increasingly now, there's going to be a blurring of what's human, what's animal, what's robot. I've always been fascinated by the architecture of the ear. It's a very sort of beautiful architecture, and also the plausible body part to try to replicate.
This is the part where we see the surgery, so I apologize.
The idea, of course, is that we're going to surgically lift the human, construct an ear flat. We're going to grow a soft earlobe using myself stem cells, and then, when everything is ready, we're going to reinsert a small microphone that used to be in there, and we're going to internet-enable the ear by electronically augmenting it. So in any Wi-Fi hotspot, people anywhere will be able to go online and listen in from my ear wherever I am and wherever you are. The response to the ear on my arm has varied from people being repulsed by the idea of altering your body to fascination and curiosity about how it was done. One of the new developments in our practice with biomarkers is what's so seductive about that is, for example, there's now sculptures in made to be sculptures all partially cellular, because of course it's really so capacity sustained with incubator, with nutrients. So for me what's interesting is that idea of making a sculpture not from inanimate matter, but rather making a sculpture that has living cells as its components.
So with my husband being a sculptor, I'm aware of their dream of building something absolutely extraordinary in terms of form and using the matter. But what transhumanists are envisioning is actually being able to sculpt organisms that are, somewhere else he says, to have this lump of cells that sigh and that have hair or nails or whatever. And that would be a more potent bio-art. This is very transhumanistic in thinking. And the interesting part about the way he's approaching is is that technology nowadays is miniaturized and you don't necessarily have to see it. You just see the results of it. While his third arm was full of wires, now what he's doing with his third ear is completely wireless and very easy to integrate, and he gets results that are more powerful with things that are less obvious. So these are just a few examples, and I will stop here by making a remark coming back to the times when I lived under communism. As a young person in our political education, one of the most difficult things was to be ridiculed as a Christian for believing such preposterous ideas like the Immaculate Conception. By that meaning, having a child born out of by other means than by the natural sexual relationship between a man and a woman. That was very much ridiculed as being impossible. And then the second one was resurrection. How can anyone believe that we can live in a state that is superior and live indefinitely forever in a resurrected form? And as I was thinking about it, I'm sure that many of us might know someone that had a child that was conceived other than through the relationship between a man and a woman. It's not an impossibility these days. On the contrary, we start to question what is actually normal and why would we question that. Same thing with resurrection. It's one of the big dreams of transhumanists, immortality. Just as you saw the artist dreaming to be a sculptor, this is dreaming to have superpowers like God, to be able to actually fulfill the demiurge, the myth of Zeus, of being the one that creates something. Or in the case of Neil Harbison, the one that wants to redesign is just another way of recreating ourselves on God's image, on our own image. So with this, I hand over to Father Dragos Herescu, who is going to start a much more difficult subject and to actually frame it within a certain worldview. Because there's no way you can relate to this information, to these philosophies, unless you position yourself in a certain place from where to look at it. And there are more ways of looking at it. And I think tonight we're going to have this one. And thank you so much.
As the Pythons would say, and now for something completely different. And I'm not sure whether this different is as an echo from a past, because trying to talk about resurrection, to frame things theologically, increasingly feels like a thing that we're carrying from the past, and probably even this medium that I'm using and we're using is kind of seems in a way obsolete by these standards that we've just seen. Or maybe it's something completely different because it proposes a different future than the one proposed in some of the videos that we've seen. So certainly it's a bit different. Now, I'll explain why I kind of chose as a tag, as a title for what I'm trying to say here, Easter, the end, and the beginning. And I'll make sure that I address this a bit later. Can you all hear me at the back? Because my volume, natural volume is not, if I speak up a little bit. Okay. Right. So I want to start by thanking Rodica, obviously, for fascinating and thought-provoking remarks. What she said makes my job both easier and difficult. It makes it easier because listening to her was, and I've had a chance to actually read some of the stuff that she's prepared for today, has helped me. I mean, it was helpful for me as a reality check. In relation to these concepts that we often struggle to put into context, like transhumanism, posthumanism, augmented humanity, and so on. As we have seen from these 3 case studies that she's presented to us, transhumanism happens as we speak. With the help of technology and science, and in the context of this effervescent cultural pluralism that we take for granted these days almost, people act on their body either to enhance it or to experiment on it or with it, or to overcome a perceived disability. In acting on their body, they also act on their humanity and give it expression in different ways, and some would say maybe in better ways. And this is a fact of life. Philosophers, theologians, politicians, clergy, I think have to accept this reality. I think we have to start from where we are. And I feel that the speed of technological progress and the possibilities that it opens up are already placing us behind the proverbial curb. It's the same thing that happened with the rise of social media. Regulation or a code of conduct, accountability, in a word, the making sense of it came after, or quite a while after it was here, and it started to create problems or to raise questions about how we use it and what this sort of medium turns us into. You know, there's a lot of stuff about people having one personality online on a chat, and then when you meet them, they're just perfectly fine. They wouldn't say the things that they say online to your face, or they wouldn't behave in the same way. So there's already a kind of a change, I think, happening just because of this new medium of the social media. Now, the difficulty in following Rodica is obviously that I have to talk about the resurrection. And it is again a twofold difficulty. Firstly, the term is loaded, no pun intended, it is a thorny issue. And has always been so from the very beginning. Otherwise, if you know your New Testament a little bit, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and if you don't, go read it, would not have been written. Secondly, it is difficult to talk about the resurrection because unlike examples of incipient transhumanism in practice, it is difficult for me to have the same level of direct access as Rodica had into these issues, into the issues of resurrection. As difficult as might, implausible as it might seem to you that a priest doesn't have the level of direct access to issues about the resurrection, I do have this difficulty. Now, I should also expound, as I said, on the title of the presentation that I'm trying to give here. Easter as the end and the beginning. The resurrection is such a central tenet of the Christian faith that really, without it, everything crumbles. So without the resurrection, nothing makes sense if you try to take Christianity seriously. Everything makes sense with it, and nothing makes sense without it. Therefore, it is the Achilles heel for anyone interested in what Christianity has to offer. It is a serious design flaw. St. Paul was existentially aware of it, and I refer back to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14. If Christ had not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. So the resurrection was a make or break topic in the incipient Christian community and outside it. The Athenians bluntly tell Paul that they will hear about the resurrection of the dead another time. That's in Acts chapter 17. Now, Easter is the end and the beginning because, on the one hand, theologically, in terms of the revelation, there is nothing else that God can do or will do until the second coming. Pentecost is predicated directly in connection to the resurrection. Christ says to the apostles, I have to go to my Father after my resurrection. If I don't go, the Holy Spirit will not come on you. So there is a direct connection there. But in terms of the revelation of God in the world, that's it. We had Jesus. We have to deal with it. We have to work with that. and there's nothing else that God will do until He comes another time. I mean, He works in different ways in our lives and in communities and so on, but in terms of that same level of revelation, it ain't gonna happen, as it were, until the second coming. That's what Christian doctrine is all about, regardless of which Christian tradition you come from. Now, on the other hand, Easter is the beginning at the same time, because it is a new beginning. Behold, I am making all things new. That's what the Son of Man says in the book of Revelation, chapter 21. Father Alexander Schmemann, an American Orthodox priest and theologian of the 20th century, said something that I think, in a way, puts it better into words than I could say it. So let's see if this is there. And I kind of put this, I think in a way this could be a good definition for what is resurrection from a theological point of view, certainly from the Eastern Orthodox tradition that I come from. Father Schmemann says, resurrection is the appearance in this world, completely dominated by time and therefore by death, of a life that will have no end. The one who rose again from the dead does not die anymore. In this world of ours, not somewhere else, not in a world that we do not know at all, but in our world, there appeared one morning someone who is beyond death and yet in our time. This is something that transhumanism, in a way, can't solve. To be in our time, in a way, well, can't solve, always trying to, in a way, but to be in our time and be beyond death is kind of this tension that we have. And kind of, we can go back into questions about what sort of existence, what to be are we talking about, whether it's a conscience, if it's something, it's a hologram of ours made up of our social posts or of a stream of data that we have, whether that is being or not. This is always the end and the beginning. Father Schmemann continues, we're always living after Easter and we're always going toward Easter. We are given not only a new meaning in life, but even death itself has acquired a new significance. In the Troparion at Easter, which is the hymn that is sung in the Orthodox Church at Easter, we say, Christ is risen from the death, trampling down death by death. So he says, we sing, He trampled down death by death. We do not say that He trampled down death by the resurrection, but by death. So there is something deeply theological about that, and kind of a paradox, a tension there. You can find the whole kind of text, it's not a long text, there on that website. In a way, he explains what he means that Christ kind of trampled down death by death and not by the resurrection. I'll leave it there while I continue. Now, so this brings me 7 minutes into my talk to the first point I'm trying to make. And it might be a rather obvious one, but it is inescapable. To talk about the resurrection is to enter the territory of belief, not of facts. Although belief can be something that for people is as strong as fact. So one enters this territory of belief either to refute it or to question it, or enters to explore it, to deepen it, to surrender in a way to this increasingly rare experience in our day and age, the experience of wonder, of mystery, of the both and rather than the either or. I think one also needs to make clear what is this resurrection that I'm referring to actually is. The resurrection that is a matter of belief, a matter of faith, is the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a real historic event and as the basis of the general resurrection of all human beings. This is the statement that has made people raise their eyebrows in disbelief since the first Easter morning. But it is also a core creedal statement in the Christian church. One finds it in Paul, again in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3, What I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried. He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And after centuries of debate, actually, in the Christian church, after tomes of apologetic writings and martyr witness, people dying because of this, we find it, this creedal statement finds its way into this Nicaea Constantinople Creed of 381, which is, some of you might be familiar with it, but in that creed, and it variants of it is present in different ways in different Christian churches today. But we do say that Christ was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate, that he was suffered, was buried, he rose again on the third day, and so on, and he will come again to judge the living and the dead. And then the creed actually ends saying that we look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come, and that's it. So the historicity part of it in relation to the resurrection is difficult, and the creedal part of it is difficult for us today. But having said all that, let me be clear. It is all right not to believe in the resurrection, because the first apostles didn't believe it. Some of them had to run to the tomb. That's the account that we work with. It was clear that they did not believe it. They did not believe the women. If you read Luke, the whole dinner in Emmaus, they were talking about, this man came, but he said that he's going to come back. He didn't, and so on. So it's all right not to believe, I think. It's all right to struggle to believe it. It's all right to ask questions about it. And it's all right, equally, I think, to accept it. To accept the mystery, to believe it. I think we need to have that sort of generosity when we think about the resurrection. Now, having said all that, let me put this up. I recommend to you the website, whatistranshumanism.org. It's wonderful. It's a fascinating resource. I've a kind of one-stop kind of place for people who are interested in the topic. I've used it quite a bit in preparing for today, and I've learned a lot from it. And it helped me make some of my final concluding remarks, I think. There are ways in which the resurrection theology and transhumanism ideas may intersect, but it's easy in a way, even for someone who doesn't necessarily have a PhD in theology, that there are ways and areas where they disagree, where they diverge significantly. Now, as Rodica mentioned, there isn't really a unifying homogeneous transhumanist doctrine, primarily because there's ongoing debate about the meaning of the terms and the ways to get there. But ironically, this is not dissimilar to the situation in Christianity today, where although we've had the better part of 2,000 years to work this out, we're still debating the meaning of and the reality of some of these core Christian tenets, like the resurrection. So maybe there's a point of similarity there already. Now, my second point is that one cannot talk about the resurrection of Christ without implicitly talking about the, drumroll, incarnation, the event of God becoming man in Jesus Christ. The incarnation element has implications that place resurrection, I think, on a corporate rather than individualistic foundation. This is I think, what I'm trying to say. Maybe that's a bit different. Why is that? Firstly, because I think thinking of the resurrection as a corporate event, not just as an individual event, as a singular event, or a singular event in the life of Jesus Christ that will be replicated in the life of every individual. I think if we think corporately, that takes us back to Genesis, to the Genesis narrative, to origins. And it also brings up questions of process, of change, of continuity and identity. And identity holds together in tension, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, the questions of who am I, where do I come from, and where am I going, what is my destiny, my meaning. And the issue of identity seems to me is one of the areas where Christian theology and the Christian theology of the resurrection and some of the claims of transhumanism connect. Now, the Genesis account is a cornerstone, I think, in this context, because the reality of Adam's humanity cannot be separated from the reality of Christ's humanity. You cannot do that theologically. You have to think that they are connected. The theology of it is that in Christ we come full circle as human beings. Christ is the new Adam, not because he makes the old Adam obsolete, but because he restores the corrupted image of God in him. He restores Adam or humanity to its original glory. And again, Paul says that in Corinthians chapter 15, "For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead also comes through a man. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all may be made alive." Because of how much emphasis we have in our society, particularly in the West, on the importance, the role and the value of the individual, although that's fine in itself, we have been taught, I think, to think quite monadic, quite individualistic about the resurrection, both of Christ and ours. So the resurrection is not a prize. It is not, I don't think it's Christ's "I've made it" moment. But I think we tend to think like that. He is victorious, but it's not a victory for himself, I think, or by himself. God raised Jesus up. And it's a victory that embraces human nature, the body, and is achieved through the body, through the frailty and perishable quality of the human body, inclusive of death. The resurrection of Christ, I think, is an ontological, cosmic, mystical, creational event that occurs in the body and the person of Christ, but the latter does not make it a private event that we will have to imitate or will imitate eventually. The theology of the resurrection claims that we become partakers of the same resurrection by a process of becoming Christ-like. It's a process of osmosis. Now, I think Paul again hints at this process of Christic osmosis. He says in Philippians chapter 3, "I want to know Christ, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead." And in Romans chapter 6, verse 5, he says, "If we have been united with him in a death like his, we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his." It's interesting to think that these verses in Romans are actually read, this is the set verse for every baptism in the Orthodox Church. So, you're baptized, welcome to dying in Christ. People don't quite want to pay attention to that. Anyway, let me show you some pictures. So I want to relate what I said to these pictures, these icons or images of the resurrection. One on the left is the traditional icon of the resurrection that you have in the Orthodox Church, and the one on the right is the more Western type icon of the resurrection that most of us, or many of you, might be familiar with. Now, I'm not trying to compare and contrast here because I think they're both theologically sound. They both share similarities in some ways. But the point I'm trying to make in relation to this corporate reality of the resurrection, that we should try and think like that, not just as an individual event that will be replicated, that we should aim for as individuals, I think is shown quite clearly in these two pictures. I think here you see the kind of the victorious lone Christ. He is alone. Versus Christ holding the hand and pulling the first man and first woman out of their tombs. And I think the icon on the right, or left, sorry, depending on where Houston, makes a statement about and a connection between the humanity that Christ shares with Adam and Eve. One image is a statement, I think, of communion, of a corporate event happening. There's more people there and they all participate in that. The soldiers here are just, pinballs. They've been toppled. But there's much more of a, we're all in that together thing in there. So one is kind of an individual achievement, and the other one is more like a corporate achievement, a shared victory, and also think maybe shared process. So, yeah. Time. Okay. So I think the resurrection is both a Janus, a wide reality, and an individual reality. We should not separate these two. Okay. I'll just finish. Skip. I think saying a few words about the theology and transhumanism points of convergence and divergence, as much as I could try and make sense of those. Now, if I understand it correctly, and listening to Rodica, the transhumanist manifesto is concerned with overcoming initially at an individual level and then at a sort of human race-wide level our existing limitations of body, mind and consciousness by means of technology and science. This requires a high degree of direct involvement and agency, and also while according to the website that I've just shown, they actually say there that at present there is no manner by which any human can become post-human. But there are ways to prepare for this, and they list among these ways: live healthily and avoid unnecessary risks, diet, exercise, and another way to do that is doing our best at living worthwhile and meaningful lives. Now, this approach, I think, is predicated on three things. First of all, I can read three things into this. First of all, there is no Deus ex machina present here. We have to do it ourselves. There's no God that can come up from heaven and kind of, yeah, you've messed it up and now I'm going to pull the rabbit out of the hat. Secondly, there's a degree of what could be deemed asceticism in a way, i.e. a tentative, considerate, moderate living, discipline. And thirdly, I think there is a profound foundational hope there, or if you want to call it a positivistic bias, in the intrinsic goodness of humans and in our capacity for betterment, for progress. Progress both seen as a result of education and cultural development, but also of technological advancements. Now, in Christian theology, the Incarnation affirms again that there is no Deus ex machina, because he came and lived with us. He did not come to... He went through the process with us. Otherwise, why? He just could have come, blah, 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 I've done it, I'm back in my clouds. But he spent time on earth with people. That's the theology of it. So he comes from within, from underneath. Again, asceticism of both body and spirit is a cornerstone of Christian life and practice. It elicits change in us. It is indispensable to progress and provides the context for overcoming human limitations. That's what we say, that ascetic practices help us overcome our limitations. And hope, obviously, is a key Christian virtue, and it's intimately linked with faith and belief, what I was saying at the beginning. There is also a sense of incremental progress and an appreciation for this progress present in both transhumanism and Christian theology. The question that many Christians struggle with, which is it real? Was it real? Is echoed, I think, in transhumanism by the question, what if it doesn't work? This is actually from the website. The answer is a mixture of hope with a kind of managed trial and error approach, which many Christians, I think, would recognize. We do our best with what we have in our context. To quote from the website, there are many incremental processes at play which may work better or worse, faster or more slowly. Even if we can't cure all diseases, we will cure many. Even if we don't get immortality, we can live healthier lives. Even if we can't freeze whole bodies and revive them, we can learn how to store organs for transplant. Even if we don't solve world hunger, we can feed a lot of people. Nothing wrong with that. Another question that Christians and transhumanists share, I think, is what about reaching perfection? What happens when we get there? And as the website phrases it, won't it be boring to live forever in a perfect world? I can relate to that. Whether I think of the kingdom of heaven as a perfect place where everybody plays the harp and angels, and it's all pink and fluffy and it sounds quite boring, or whether that's an earthly transhumanist project, sort of society. And again, to quote from the website, it says, "It is probably wiser to speak of improving the world rather than making it perfect. Would it be boring to live? For an indefinitely long time in a greatly improved world? The world could surely be improved over the way it is now, including becoming less boring." Now, this perpetual progress, open-ended perspective will be all too familiar to anyone aware of Gregory of Nyssa's The Life of Moses, for example. It's an ascetical writing of the 4th century. There, Gregory's argument is that perfection rests not in reaching the destination itself, but rather in taking part in the journey, which is a process of continual becoming by partaking in the life of God. And that process is predicated on the ability of humans to change, to progress, on the infinite nature of God, which ensures the perpetual character of the engagement, and of course on the incarnation of Christ. It is important to note also that this understanding of perpetual progress in the theology of Gregory of Nyssa is not exclusively vertical, but actually horizontal at the same time, because it is connected to human action and agency in the world. So basically you can't say in theology or in asceticism, if we only focus on God and ignore our human fellows, we can never reach perfection or progress in any way. So they need to be connected. So to kind of end up, a bullet point listing of the points of divergence between a Christian theology of the resurrection and transhumanism, in my mind, would include, firstly, the fundamental immanent aspect of the progress that you see in transhumanism, and then kind of the survival of the species, kind of maybe a neo-Darwinian imperative as well. We have to do our best to ensure that the species survives in this space. There's also a this-worldly orientation for the endeavor based on a naturalistic outlook. And finally, I think there's transhumanism affirms a salvific character and potential of knowledge, which to anyone familiar with kind of the history of Christian thought or philosophy brings echoes of the of Gnosticism, for example, and that sort of philosophies. Now, in the Orthodox East, I need to say this, it's more on a personal note, the resurrection is not an event in the past. Okay? And that is where it's very difficult to bridge, I think, these things, because we tend to use this language that is very hard to swallow if you're not into it. But it's not an event in the past. It's not confined to the depths of history. But it is a historical. But because it involves Jesus Christ, fully God and fully man, it is an event that cannot theologically be circumscribed or constrained by history. Also, because it is an event that involves Jesus Christ, particularly in the Orthodox Church, but I think in other kind of Christian traditions that echo that sort of spirit, we tend to relate to it sacramentally. It's an event, a historic event, a real historic event, that's what we call it, but we relate to it sacramentally, not just historically. The two together. Which is to say that I relate to it as a moment of encounter, of sharing, and of thanksgiving, that kind of sum up sacrament, and all of which are process-bound and elicit personal change. To me, to say that the resurrection is merely a past event is like saying that the moment when I fell in love with my wife is a past event, and that unique moment I fell in love with her is in the past, and I am now living the consequences of that moment, but I cannot retrieve that reality. In fact, for me, that moment I would like to think that is relived every day. The moment I fell in love with my wife happens again when I wake up in the morning. I'm not trying to sound sentimental here. That is actually a fact. Otherwise, I would kick her out of the bed because she takes the best side, always. And that moment is activated every day. So that's important. It both roots and feeds the love I feel today. It makes it real, it makes it fresh and present. And it is made real by my daily experience and participation in that relationship. If I were no longer in a relationship with my wife, then yes, that initial event of my falling in love with her would be in the past. Period. I wouldn't want to know about it or of her because I'm no longer in a relationship with her. I don't need it. In the same way, because the resurrection is part of a relationship with the person of Jesus Christ that people of faith tend to have, and Jesus Christ, who once resurrected, dies no more, the resurrection is not and cannot be a past event, or merely a past event. And I think to finish, it also argues essentially the point that improvement, betterment of individual and society is achieved through the connection and exchange between human beings as persons in relationship, not by technology as a third party that we sneak in somehow. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks. That's all. I've run over. That's a good book if you're interested. I think it's a good book if you're interested in the history of the debate, because I had a section here which I think it's also quite fascinating about people asking questions. How are the dead raised? What is being raised? What sort of body is being raised? What sort of identity is kept? This man does a brilliant job of kind of summing up this thinking, how people wrestled centuries ago and continue to wrestle with these sort of questions. Will I have the same color of the eyes? Will my hair be gray or will it be red or blonde? What age will I be resurrected as? And so on. So things that again make it kind of real questions about, kind of almost like technical questions about the resurrection. So that's a good book.